Each evening, Nyx draws her wings across the sky. The ancient Greeks described this as a physical thing, not a metaphor for the sun going down, not a poetic way of saying that darkness falls, but an actual gesture made by an actual being, vast and feathered, and older than the gods of Olympus, spreading her dark wings from one edge of the visible world to the other as evening comes on. The stars that appear as she does this were understood, in some accounts, to belong to her veil, small points of light, visible through the cloth she wore around herself, or caught in the feathers of her wings as she moved overhead. It is a very old image, and a very calm one. The goddess of night is not frightening in this account. She is enormous, and she is doing what she has always done, and the world goes dark beneath her in the way it always has. From this darkness certain things were born, not metaphorically born. In the tradition preserved by the Latin mythographer Hyginus in his Asteric Fabulae Asterix, one of the most important surviving catalogues of Greek mythological genealogy, a precise and extraordinary family tree is recorded. Nyx, night herself, and Erebus, the god of deep darkness, the kind that exists not merely at the surface of evening, but in the furthest depths beneath the earth, produced between them a generation of children who were not gods in the Olympian sense, but something older and more fundamental. From this union came Thanatos, who was death. From it came Hypnos, who was sleep. From it came the Moirai, the Fates, the three who spun and measured and cut the thread of every life. From it came Nemesis, the force of righteous consequence, the weight that balanced the scales when mortal fortune tilted too far in one direction. And from it, according to Hyginus, came Charon. Charon, the ferryman of the dead, was born of night and darkness. That is where this story begins. It is worth pausing on what that actually means within the structure of Greek cosmological thinking, because it is not simply a dramatic way of saying that Charon was associated with death. In Hesiod's Asterix Theogony Asterix, one of the oldest surviving accounts of how the Greek cosmos came into being, the very first things that existed were chaos, then Gaia, then Erebus and Nyx. These were not gods in the way Zeus was a god, not personalities with preferences and rivalries and stories of transformation. They were ontological conditions, the state of darkness, the state of night, the condition of the void, the ground of everything. When Hyginus places Charon among their children, he is situating the ferryman not within the generation of gods who govern civilization and weather and the sea, but in the generation that preceded order itself. Charon belongs to the first things. He comes before the Olympians. He is in a sense older than the shape of the world. This is one reason the ancient Greeks did not treat Charon simply as a frightening figure, though his task ferrying the dead across the boundary between the living world and what lay beyond it might seem to invite that response. He was not a monster. He was not a punishment. He was a being who had emerged from the same fundamental stratum of existence as sleep itself, and night itself, and fate itself, and he held a specific and bounded role within a cosmos that was understood to be orderly in its deepest structures. The darkness that produced him was the darkness Nyx spread each evening across the sky, vast and unhurried and perfectly regular, arriving each night on its enormous wings and departing each morning in the same way, not as a threat, but as the world continuing to be the shape it always was. It is a different relationship to darkness than the one that might come most readily to mind. Nyx, in the Hesiodic tradition, was not malevolent. She was primordial. She was the condition inside which sleep was possible, inside which dreams occurred, inside which the night-blooming world did its particular work. Homer, in the Iliad describes even Zeus as hesitant to anger her, not because she was terrible, but because she was old in a way that predated his authority, old in a way that made her presence something to move carefully around, the way one moves carefully around something that is simply very large and has been where it is for a very long time. Her children inherited this quality. Hypnos, her son, was not frightening either. He was restful. He was needed. He came each night and performed his function, and the world was better for it. Charon, in this genealogy, is his brother, not the brother of war or plague or violence, but the brother of sleep, the same wing of the same vast dark family. Thanatos was their brother too, death as a person, death as a figure who came quietly and gathered the dying when the time was right. In the Greek tradition, Thanatos was not cruel. He was, in several sources, described as gentle. He arrived and performed his function, and what he collected he passed to Hermes, the divine messenger, who gathered souls at the threshold between the upper world and the lower one, and guided them downward along the road that led to the water's edge. The family arrangement was tidy in its logic. Death came first and gathered, the guide came next and conducted, and at the end of the road, at the edge of the water, Charon was waiting, as he had always been with his boat. The earliest written trace of this figure in Greek literature is a fragment attributed to the 6th century BCE poet Stesichorus, a lyric poet from the Greek West who was active in Sicily and southern Italy. The fragment itself no longer exists as an independent text. What survives of it exists only because a later writer quoted it within a different work, words preserved inside other words, a text held inside another text, the way one cup might be set inside a larger one to keep it from rolling away in a dark room. The mythographer Athenaeus, writing in the 2nd or 3rd century CE, quoted a few lines from what he identified as Stesichorus's poem, and those lines contain what is believed to be the oldest surviving written reference to Charon in Greek literature. This is the nature of much ancient textual survival. The original is gone, the quotation persists, and the quotation within a later work has its own quality of depth, the words existing at 2 removes from their origin, carrying the trace of a tradition already old enough in the 6th century BCE to appear in a lyric poem as something the audience would already know. Stesichorus was not inventing Charon. He was drawing on a figure that was already part of the common mythological vocabulary of the Greek world. The myth of the underworld ferryman was, in the archaic period, already well settled, already worn smooth at the edges from telling. There is something restful about that. The oldest written reference to Charon that we have is already not the beginning. The text that contains the oldest reference is itself a quotation. The figure it describes had been part of the Greek imagination long before anyone wrote his name down, moving through the oral tradition the way figures in that tradition always moved, told and retold at symposia, carved into vases, offered to in ritual spaces, built into the funeral customs of ordinary people who knew without being told who would be waiting at the far edge of the road when the time came. History reaches backward towards something that was already there. The tradition goes deeper than its oldest surviving record. In the city of Athens, the ancient cemetery of the Kerameikos stood just outside the Dipylon Gate, which was the main entrance to the city in antiquity, through which the road to Eleusis passed. The Kerameikos was a working burial ground for centuries, and its excavations in the 20th century revealed a landscape of extraordinary density. Burials upon burials upon burials, layers of the dead going down through the centuries, like the strata of a cliff face exposed. In that ground, archaeologists found evidence of two distinct kinds of religious practice that spoke to a fundamental division in the Greek religious world. One kind of practice was directed upward, toward the sky, toward the Olympian gods, toward the region of light and open space where the gods of sun and thunder and the sea were understood to reside. The other kind was directed downward, into the earth, into the dark. The distinction between Olympian and chthonic worship was not simply a matter of which gods you were addressing. It was a structural feature of the Greek religious system, expressed in specific ritual forms that were physically different from each other. Olympian offerings were typically burned on raised altars, their smoke rising. Chthonic offerings were often poured into the ground or placed directly in pits cut into the earth. Asterisk Bothras. Asterisk, those pits were called, a Greek word for precisely that kind of hollow, that downward directed place of offering. The direction of the ritual expressed the direction of the divine being it was intended for. You reached upward for the Olympians, for the chthonic powers, for the gods and beings of the earth's depths. You reached down. Charon was among the beings addressed in this way. As the child of Erebus and Nyx, as a figure whose existence and function were defined by what lay beneath and beyond the living world, he belonged to the chthonic category entirely. The offerings made to him or to the powers associated with his function were not raised on altars. They were directed into the earth, into the dark, toward the place where he was understood to permanently reside, on the far side of the water, at the bottom of the world, waiting in the way that things outside of time wait, without impatience, for the work to continue. This is one of the ways in which Charon's position in the Greek cosmological system was understood to be specific and bounded. He was not everywhere. He was not associated with death in a general or pervasive sense. He was, very precisely, associated with a single act, the crossing of the water, and with a single location, the far edge of the world, at the boundary between the living and the dead. His siblings were broad in their operation. The Natos moved through the upper world, wherever the dying were. Hypnos descended on sleepers everywhere. The fates were present at every birth and every death, measuring and cutting. But Charon had a post. He was stationed. He waited. The dead came to him, and he took them across, and that was what he was, a ferryman in the most literal and specific sense of the word. The Greek name Charon, Charon in its Latinized form, carries within it, according to the most widely accepted scholarly etymology, something about the quality of seeing. The name is most commonly connected to the Proto-Indo-European root that gives rise to the Greek word karopos, term used in ancient Greek to describe a particular quality of vision, fierce, intent, gleaming, keen in a way that suggests both intensity of focus and a kind of brightness in the eye itself. The word was used in ancient Greek poetry to describe the eyes of lions, of eagles, of beings whose gaze was understood to be penetrating in a way that ordinary human vision was not. Ancient vase painters took this seriously. On the red figure and black figure pottery that survives from the classical period, in the detailed funerary scenes that were painted onto white ground lithoi, those pale, slender oil flasks placed in graves with the dead Charon appears consistently with eyes that are rendered differently from the other figures in the composition, while Hermes, or the soul figure, or the mourning figure at the water's edge, might have eyes that are calm and level and broadly painted in the manner typical of the period. Charon's eyes are described by archaeologists and art historians as widened, fixed, intensely rendered, eyes that look as though they are attending to something that other figures in the scene cannot see. The vase painters were not simply illustrating a story, they were recording a name. They were painting the etymology of Charon's name onto fired clay in a color that lasted. These vases were not decorative objects kept on a shelf. They were grave goods. They were placed inside the burial itself, or laid beside the body, or positioned at the entrance to the tomb, their images visible at the moment of burial and then covered over with earth. The image of the crossing, Hermes at one end of the road, Charon at the other, the small figure of the soul between them at the point of handoff, accompanied the dead into the ground. The myth was not simply told about the dead, it was taken into the ground with them. The image of where they were going was placed beside them as they went. There is a particular quality of labor in the way Charon was understood. He was not passive. He was not simply present at the boundary as a guardian or an obstacle. He worked. He held a pole, a long staff used to push a flat-bottomed boat through shallow or slow-moving water, the kind of implement that actual boatmen on actual rivers in the ancient Mediterranean world used in exactly this way, because the rivers they crossed were often shallow, and the current was slow, and the business of moving a laden boat from one bank to another was a matter of physical effort, applied steadily and without interruption. Charon was a craftsman. He had a tool and a skill and a task, and he applied them with the consistency of someone who had been doing the same thing for a very long time and would be doing it for a very long time still. This is another way in which the Greek tradition situated him as a figure of order rather than chaos. The underworld in the Greek imagination was not a place of disorder or violence or randomness. It was organized. It had its geography, its officials, its rules, its procedures. Charon was one element in a system that operated with the regularity of something that had been in place since before the world's current arrangement existed. The dead arrived. They were guided by Hermes to the water's edge. Charon took them across. This was the sequence. It had been the sequence since the earliest mythological time. It would be the sequence until the end of whatever time the Greek cosmos was understood to exist within. Hermes Psychopompos, the Hermes who was guide of souls, whose epithet *psychopompos, asterisk means precisely that, conductor of souls, was one of the most complex and multifaceted figures in the Greek divine family. He was the messenger of the gods, the god of travelers and trade and thieves and eloquence and luck, the divine boundary crosser whose function was to move between worlds that other beings could not easily traverse. In his psychopomp role, he carried his asterisk caduceus, asterisk, the staff entwined with serpents that was his particular emblem, and he descended from the upper world to the edge of the underworld's water, with the souls of the newly dead beside him, leading them by the hand in some depictions, ushering them forward with the efficient care of a guide who knows the way and has traveled it many times. On the white ground lekythoi, the funerary vases whose pale surface allowed for particularly fine and careful painting, this moment of handoff was depicted with great precision. Hermes stands at one side of the scene, his figure upright, his caduceus visible, one hand extended toward a small figure that represents the soul, sometimes depicted as a miniature adult, sometimes more abstractly, but always distinct, always in the position of the lead. Beside the boat, or already in it, Charon waits. His pole is upright or tilted at the angle of readiness. His eyes are wide and fixed and attending. The soul passes from one hand to another, from the guide who walked them down from the world of the living to the ferryman who will take them across to the world of the dead. Each of these two figures held exactly one part of the same journey, not more, not less. Hermes held the upper portion, the descent from where the dying became the dead, the long road downward to the water's edge, the transition from one kind of existence to another. Charon held the lower portion, the water itself, the crossing, the final passage from the bank of the living world to the bank of the dead world. Between them they accounted for the entire journey. Neither could do the other's part, neither needed to. The division of labor was clean and logical, and had been so from the beginning of the tradition. This kind of precise division was characteristic of how the Greeks organized their understanding of the divine. The gods did not have vague or overlapping portfolios with fuzzy boundaries between them. They had domains, specific, bounded areas of responsibility, governed by rules and customs that were understood to have existed since the earliest arrangement of the cosmos. Zeus governed the sky and the sovereignty of the divine order. Poseidon governed the sea. Hades governed the underworld. Within Hades' domain, the various figures who staffed it, the judges, the guardians, the ferrymen, had their own specific and bounded functions within the larger system. Charon was not simply associated with the underworld in a general sense. He was associated with a specific place within it, performing a specific action with specific conditions attached to his service. The system was orderly. The system had always been orderly. Charon's orderliness was part of what he was. It is worth holding for a moment the quality of what it meant to be born from Erebus and Nyx, to have emerged not from a divine parent, with a personality and a history and a series of mythological adventures, but from a condition. Erebus was not a person who happened to embody darkness. In the Greek cosmological understanding, Erebus was darkness itself, specifically the deep darkness beneath the earth, the darkness that was not the absence of sunlight, but something more fundamental, the dark that preceded light's existence, the dark inside the ground and beneath the sea and at the bottom of things. And Nyx was night itself, not the period of darkness between sunsets, but the deity whose nature was nocturnal, whose existence was coextensive with the night sky, who moved and spread and withdrew in the way the night did, with the enormous and indifferent regularity of a fundamental feature of the cosmos. From these two conditions, Charon came. He was not made in the way craftsmen were made, not born in the way mortal children were born, not fashioned from clay or wood or the divine substance of an Olympian god's particular essence. He arose from darkness and night in the way that certain things arise from conditions, the way silence arises from the absence of sound, the way stillness arises when motion has ended. He was what that particular combination of primordial forces produced, and what it produced was a ferryman, a figure with a pole and a boat, a being whose eyes were keen, and whose function was specific, and whose post was permanent. The Greek cosmological imagination is sometimes described as having been particularly good at assigning precise roles to precise figures, at building systems in which everything had its place and its function and its relationship to everything else. This is visible in the genealogies, the careful accounting of who came from whom, which gods were descended from which primordial forces, how the various generations related to each other and to the cosmos they inhabited. Hyginus's catalog, in which Charon appears as the son of Erebus and Nyx, is part of this tradition of accounting, an attempt to place every figure in the mythological landscape within a coherent relational structure, to show that nothing was arbitrary, that every figure had a reason for being what it was that was traceable back through its parentage and its position in the cosmic family. Charon's position in that family was clear and stable. He was not one of the gods who had stories of transformation, who changed form, or traveled between worlds, or quarreled with other divinities over territory or precedence. He did not accumulate mythology in the way that Hermes did, who was a thief and a messenger and a psychopomp and the inventor of the lyre, all at once, all throughout the tradition. Charon held one function from the beginning of the tradition to its end. He was the ferryman. He waited. He took the dead across, and when the crossing was done, he returned to his place at the water and waited for the next one. There is a quality of permanence in that, not the permanence of stone or gold, which endure because they resist change, but the permanence of function, of a thing that continues to be itself because it is doing exactly what it was made to do and has no occasion to become anything else. The fates cut threads, Hypnos brought sleep, Thanatos gathered the dying, and Charon, at his post at the water's edge, moved the dead from one shore to the other, and had done so since before the Olympians were born, and would do so in whatever arrangement followed the current one. The archaic Greek world that produced the first written references to Charon was a world in which the dead were understood to require careful management. Not management in the bureaucratic sense, but in the sense of attention, careful attention paid by the living to the condition and needs of those who had died, expressed in specific ritual acts that were understood to have real consequences for the dead person's situation in the world below. The coins placed in the mouths of the dead, the offerings poured into the ground, the laments sung at the graveside, the 9th day rites, the 30th day rites, the annual observances at which the dead were addressed and fed and recognized as continuing presences in the world, present in a different form, but not absent. Charon was part of this system of care. To know that he waited at the water's edge, that the dead would need his service, that they would need the coin to pay his fare, this was not a source of dread in the Greek world. It was a fact of the cosmic order, the same kind of fact as the fact that night followed day, or that the fates were present at every birth. It was something to be prepared for, something to be provided for. The living who placed the coin in the mouth of the dead were not performing a gesture of fear. They were performing a gesture of practical care for someone who was about to make a specific journey and would need a specific provision to complete it. The family that gathered around the body of the dead in the Greek world understood, in placing that coin, that their person would soon be walking the road that led down to the water, and that Hermes would be waiting at the threshold, and that the road would end at the place where Charon stood, with his pole and his keen and gleaming eyes, ready to take them across. It was not a frightening picture, it was an organized one. The world had made provision for this. The cosmos had a procedure for it. The procedure was old and orderly and had been in place since the primordial darkness and the primordial night had produced, between them, the figure who would stand at the water's edge and do his particular and permanent work. Nyx spread her wings across the sky each evening. This is how the ancient accounts described it. The darkness came, enormous and feathered, covering the stars she had made or that her passage revealed, settling over the world in the way that something very vast and very calm settles without hurry, without noise, simply arriving because that was what it did, what it had always done, what it would always do. And from the substance of that darkness, from the deep conditions that she and Erebus between them embodied, a family had come into the world that held all the things the dark was responsible for. Sleep, Swallet, Gehyudmiron, fate night itself perpetuated in the goddess's children, and the ferryman, whose eyes were bright and fixed and attending, whose pole was ready, whose boat was waiting. The road that led to that boat began somewhere in the world of the living, at the moment of death, at the threshold of the house where the body lay, at the beginning of whatever process of departure the tradition described, and at the far end of that road, at the water's edge, Two figures stood at different points along the same quiet passage. One held the traveler's hand and walked the downward road. One held a pole and waited at the water. Hermes, with his caduceus and his quick intelligence and his long experience of crossing between worlds, stood at the beginning of that final stretch, ready to conduct. And Charon, who had come from night and darkness, who had always been at his post, who held one part of one specific journey with the steadiness of someone whose function has never changed, stood at the other end of the same road, pole in hand, eyes keen and wide, and watching the road that came down to the river, waiting for whoever Hermes would bring next along the quiet way. The volcanic lake of Avernus sits in a nearly perfect circle in the Campanian hills of southern Italy, its surface dark and almost entirely still. The wooded slopes rise around it on every side, and the water below reflects the sky without quite becoming it. A darker version of whatever is above, held in a bowl of ancient stone. In antiquity, ancient travelers and poets reported that birds would not fly over this lake, that the air above it was too heavy, too close to something, for living wings to cross. Virgil knew this place. He walked to it, or near enough to walk to it, and when he needed a door into the underworld for his Aeneas to pass through, he chose this specific lake, this specific dark water in its ring of hills, as the place where the world of the living and the world of the dead were separated by the thinnest possible distance. The cave entrance lay nearby, and through it the geography of the afterlife extended inward and downward through a darkness that the ancient tradition had mapped with considerable care. The underworld the ancient Greeks described was not a vague and formless shadowland. It was a geography. It had regions and rivers and specific places with specific names and specific characters, laid out in a cosmological architecture that different sources described in overlapping and largely consistent terms across many centuries. The map was not fixed in every detail. Plato described it differently from Homer, and Virgil's Latin inheritance added textures and perspectives of its own. But the overall structure, the sense of distinct territories separated by moving water, held across the tradition with enough consistency that the word geography is genuinely appropriate. This was an imagined landscape, held and transmitted by a culture that took it seriously, understood to reflect something real about what happened to the dead and where they went. To enter it, in Virgil's account, is to pass through the cave near Avernus and move downward into a vestibule, a kind of threshold space that exists before the properly organized underworld begins. And what the vestibule contains is striking not for its terror, but for its specificity. Grief and avenging cares have made their beds there, according to Virgil. Old age is present, disease, fear, hunger, whose counsels turn toward wickedness, poverty, death, and death's own brother, sleep. These figures stand in the vestibule like the subjects of a very complete and careful inventory, each one given a place, as though the entrance to the realm of the dead were a room through which everything that afflicts the living also passes, catalogued and set aside. A great elm tree spreads its old branches across the center of this space, and in every leaf, under every branch, the dreams of the dead cling like the faint weight of something almost weightless. The tree is a specific architectural feature. It stands in the vestibule. The dreams adhere to its underside, pale and numerous, the way a colony of small things clings to the underside of a surface it has found. Homer's geography is older and less elaborately furnished. In the Odyssey, Odysseus travels to the far edge of the world, beyond the stream of Oceanus, the great river that the Greeks believed encircled the known earth, to a sunless coast where the Cimmerians live in permanent fog. The Cimmerians are not the dead. They are a people, or a kind of people, who happen to inhabit the threshold geography between the living world and what lies beyond it, a land where the sun does not come, and mist covers everything at every hour. Odysseus does not descend through a cave. He reaches the edge of the world by sailing, and he performs his rituals there at the margin, in a trench dug in the earth, and the dead come to him across that threshold to speak. The entrance to the underworld in Homer is a place defined not by architecture, but by the complete absence of ordinary light, by the quality of a world from which the sun has been permanently removed. Between these two visions, centuries apart, a coherent cosmology takes shape. The underworld exists beneath the world of the living, separated from it by physical distance and by moving water, and its interior geography is organized around those rivers. Plato, writing in the Phaedo names 5 of them, each with a character as distinct as a different kind of weather. The Styx is the first and the most cosmologically significant, the river of oath and boundary, whose name the Greek tradition associated with the act of hating, or with the deepest cold. The Acheron is the river of woe, carrying the weight of grief in its current. The Phlegethon runs with fire. The Cocytus carries lamentation, and the Lethe, whose name means forgetting, wins through its own underground passage, and souls drink from it before they are reborn, so that everything they were, and everything they knew, and everyone they loved, dissolves into the water and is gone. Hesiod, writing in the Theogony describes the Styx in terms that make clear this is no ordinary river. The Styx is simultaneously a goddess and a body of water, a daughter of the Titans Oceanus and Tethys, born from the same vast coupling that produced all the world's rivers and seas. Her hull stands at the far edge of the cosmos, described with a precision that feels architectural: pillars of silver, a roof held up at the outermost rim of everything, silver pillars, a specific building material, a specific location, at the edge of the world where the cosmos simply runs out and there is nothing beyond. The image does not ask for metaphorical interpretation. It presents itself as structural fact. The hall of the Styx is there, at the boundary, with its silver supports and its enormous cosmological function, standing at the point where the world ends. And the cosmological function was absolute. When the Olympian gods needed to make an oath that could not be broken, they swore by the Styx. Zeus himself was bound by this constraint. An oath sworn on the Styx's waters was the most inviolable thing the cosmos contained, more binding than a promise made to a person, more permanent than a law, because the Styx itself was older than the Olympian order, older than Zeus's authority, a substance of boundary and oath that predated the gods who governed the sky and sea and civilization. To break an oath sworn on the Styx was not merely a betrayal, but a violation of the cosmological structure of reality. The tradition takes this seriously enough that it records the consequences in detail. A god who swore falsely by the Styx was deprived of breath and voice for a great year, suspended in a kind of existence without action or speech, the punishment calibrated to match the gravity of what had been broken. The Acheron is a different kind of presence in the tradition. Where the Styx is a goddess and a cosmic boundary, the Acheron appears in the ancient sources as a river with the character of its name, the river of woe, the river through which grief itself flows. Certain ancient sources held that the Acheron was the actual river of the crossing, the one on which the ferryman's boat moved, rather than the Styx. The tradition was not perfectly consistent on this point, and the two rivers were sometimes conflated sometimes kept distinct. What both rivers shared was the function of separation, the quality of being the water that divided the world of the living from the world of the dead, a boundary you could not cross without assistance and could not cross back without an exceptional form of permission. The phlegethon, whose name connects to the Greek word for burning, was understood to run with fire rather than water, a river of flame moving through the underworld as the rivers of water move through it, carrying a different element, marking a different quality of the geography below. Plato, in the asterisk Phaedo, asterisk describes it as encircling the Tartarian region, the deepest and most severe part of the underworld, reserved for those whose crimes against the living were beyond ordinary reckoning. Fire circling the lowest place in the landscape of the dead, not consuming anything, simply present as the specific character of that boundary, the way the other rivers were present as the specific characters of their own regions. The Cocytus, the river of lamentation, was understood to carry sound as well as water. The tradition described it as bearing the voices of the unburied dead, those who had died without proper funerary rites, whose bodies had been left unburied on the earth's surface, their voices traveling in the current, audible in the underworld below as a continuous sound of grief. Not metaphor, in the logic of the tradition, a physical feature of the geography, as factual as the course of a river on a map, except that this river's course ran beneath everything, and its specific acoustic character was the gathered lamentation of those who were still waiting at the near shore to cross. The river named for grief contained the sound of grief. The tradition mapped its cosmology this exactly. And then the Lethe. The Lethe ran through a cave or an underground passage, less visible in the geography of the underworld than the rivers that bordered its various regions, and souls came to it at a particular moment, after judgment, before rebirth, at the specific threshold between one life and another. The gesture the tradition described was a small and private one, cupped hands at the water's edge, the soul bending down to drink, and in the drinking everything dissolved. Name, memory, the particular quality of being the person one had been. All of it went into the water and was gone. The soul that straightened up from the bank of the Lethe had nothing left of what it had been, was blank in the way that beginning is blank, ready to be sent back into the world as something new. The specific gesture, cupped hands, dark water, the last act of one existence before the next, is one of the most concentrated images in the entire tradition, carrying everything the Greeks understood about forgetting and beginning again in a single, quiet, utterly specific movement. Movement, Plato's geography of the underworld, developed most fully in the asterisk Phaedo asterisk, is not identical to Homer's, and it is not identical to Virgil's, and the tradition did not require it to be. These were maps of a place that no living person had visited and returned from to report accurately, and the maps carried the marks of the hands that drew them. What persisted across the different versions was the fundamental architecture, the rivers as boundaries and conduits, and Quenyer Platitrarive, in sit and conduits of the Dagthuin, by Ayers Kubing, bout of the demerge ferment codgers living with diggingware, and just Dow for out. The regions as destinations appropriate to different kinds of lives. The underworld as a place with an interior logic that reflected the values and the cosmological imagination of the culture that described it. The geography was not random. Every detail meant something. The Styx was the river of oath, because oaths and boundaries shared a nature. The Lethe was the river of forgetting, because forgetting and rebirth shared a nature. The map followed its own coherent principles. There is a cave near Avernus that ancient writers identified as one entrance to the underworld, and there are other caves in the Greek world that the tradition associated with descent to the realm of the dead. The cave at Teneron, at the southern tip of the Peloponnese, was another, a deep fissure in the rock at the very southern point of the Greek mainland, where the land ran out and the sea began. The Greeks of the classical period associated these specific places, these openings in the earth, with the possibility of passage downward. They were not gates that could be opened or locks that could be turned. They were places where the distance between the world of the living and the world of the dead seemed thinner, where the ground itself had a different quality, the way certain coastal headlands have a different quality from inland ground, a feeling of edge, of being at the last of one thing before it becomes another. The land near these entrances in the tradition was often described as appropriate to the threshold it marked. Virgil's Avernus is surrounded by dark woods, its lake heavy and still, the air above it close. The region at the edge of the world where Homer places the entrance to the underworld is defined by fog and the complete absence of the sun. The Cimmerians living there never see sunlight, even when it rises, because the land they occupy exists in a permanent atmospheric condition that excludes it. These threshold landscapes carry the same logic as the rivers inside the underworld. The geography reflects the nature of the territory. The place where the living world ends looks like a place where the living world ends. Once inside, the geography the tradition described was organized by destination. The Asphodel Meadows, named in Homer's Asterisk, Odyssey Asterisk, and referenced throughout the Greek tradition, were the vast central region of the underworld where the majority of souls spent their afterlife, those who had lived neither with exceptional virtue nor with exceptional wickedness, whose lives had been ordinary in the full sense of the word. The asphodel plant for which this region was named is a real plant, and its reality matters to the tradition in a specific way. The asphodel, its flowers pale white to pale pink, its tall, thin stalks rising from rocky Mediterranean ground, was planted on actual Greek graves, placed in the soil of the burial site, so that the dead would have their characteristic food immediately available. The plant that grew in the mythological meadows of the ordinary dead was the same plant that grew in the cemeteries of Athens and across the Greek world, visible on hillsides and rocky coastal ground across the Mediterranean today, exactly as it was when the tradition first described it. The asphodel meadows, as Homer depicts them, are not punishing. They are not the Tartarian depths or the place of fire and suffering reserved for the very worst. They are simply vast and pale and quiet, an enormous plain of the characteristic plant, through which the souls of the ordinary dead move in a kind of dimmed existence, present, but without the intensity that characterized life in the upper world, the way a fire is present when it has burned down to coals, still warm, but no longer leaping. Achilles, encountered in that plain by Odysseus, says he would rather be a poor man's slave on the earth than a king among the dead, not because the asphodel meadows are horrible, but because they are dim, because even a diminished life in the world of sunlight and sensation is more alive than the largest existence available below. The meadows are enormous, and they are still. That stillness is not a torture, it is simply what they are. The Elysian fields, or Elysium, occupied a different region of the geography, the destination of those whom the gods had favored, the heroically virtuous, those who had been granted a particular portion of divine grace. Some versions of the tradition placed Elysium on the western edge of the world rather than underground, at the Isles of the Blessed beyond the stream of Oceanus, a paradise geography of perpetual warmth and ease, rather than the pale dimness of the asphodel meadows. The geography is not perfectly consistent across all sources, but the character of the place is consistent, Elysium was where things were well, where the afterlife resembled the best of life, where the dead who arrived there found a continuation of something recognizably good, fields and light, and the quality of a day in which nothing demands anything. Tartarus stood at the other extreme, the deepest part of the underworld, as far below the surface of the earth as the earth is below the sky. Hesiod describes the distance in those terms, a symmetry of depth, the cosmos organized around its central surface, with equal measures of height and depth extending from it. Into Tartarus went the Titans, imprisoned after their defeat by the Olympian gods, and into it went those whose crimes against the divine order or against other human beings were too severe for ordinary treatment. The tradition was specific about who went to Tartarus and what happened there. Sisyphus with his boulder, Tantalus in his pool, Ixion on his wheel. These were individual punishments matched to individual crimes, the geography of the punishment zone organized by a logic of poetic correspondence, the suffering mirroring in its specific character, the specific nature of what had been done. The judgments that sorted souls into these different regions were carried out by judges whose authority derived from their own particular histories with justice and death. Minos and Rhadamanthus, sons of Zeus who had been rulers of mortal kingdoms and had given just governance to their peoples, served as judges of the dead alongside Acus. The tradition in the Phaedo describes the soul arriving at the judgment seat, stripped of its body, stripped of earthly wealth and status and the social positions that had defined it in life, and the judge reading the soul itself, its history written into its substance rather than into its circumstances. The nakedness of the soul at judgment was a specific theological point, all the things that had distinguished one person from another in the upper world, the wealth, the social standing, the clothing, the family, were irrelevant here. What remained was what the soul actually was. The geography organized itself around the judgment's outcomes. The path to the right led toward Elysium. The path to the left led downward toward Tartarus. Straight ahead, or through the asphodel meadows, was the destination of the majority, the unremarkable afterlife of those who had lived unremarkable lives in the upper world. 3 paths, 3 destinations, the geography of the underworld corresponding to the moral architecture of Greek thought about how lives were lived and what they meant. Water separated all of it from the world above. Whatever entrance you took into the underworld, Avernus, Tainaron, the far edge of the world beyond the Cimmerians, you arrived eventually at a riverbank, and at the water's edge the living world came to a definitive stop. The rivers were not simply symbolic. They were understood as physical features of the cosmological landscape, real water moving in real courses beneath the surface of the real earth, carrying their specific natures, oath, grief, fire, lamentation, forgetting, through the geography below, in the same way that rivers above the earth carry their physical characters through the landscapes they cross. The tradition imagined the underworld's rivers with the same matter-of-fact acceptance with which it imagined the Nile, or the Peneus, or the Alpheus. They were rivers, they flowed, and they defined the territories on either side of them. On the near shore, before the crossing, the ancient tradition placed a crowd. Virgil describes them specifically, a multitude coming down to the riverbank, like the leaves that fall in the forest's first cold days of autumn, like the birds that gather over the water when the season turns and carries them south. Souls arriving from the upper world, moving toward the water's edge, pressing forward toward the crossing they needed to make. The near shore was not empty or peaceful. It was populated by this continuous arrival, the souls of the recently dead making their way to the beginning of what came next. The image is not mournful in its Virgilian rendering, it is autumnal. It has the specific quality of a natural process, an ordered, large, and seasonal gathering, the way great movements of birds are not sad even when they mark the end of something. And in the geography of the underworld, in the landscape that ancient Greek cosmology constructed beneath the surface of the world it inhabited, all of this had the character of a real and knowable place. The rivers had their names and their natures. The regions had their populations and their qualities. The paths from the judgment led where they led, and the fields on the far bank were what the tradition said they were, pale and large and quiet in one direction, lit and eased in another, deep and structured with consequences in the third. The map was not complete in every version. Different sources filled in different details, argued over different points, placed certain elements in certain positions and other elements differently. What never varied was the fundamental seriousness with which the tradition held the geography, the sense that the underworld was a real place in the cosmological structure of the world, as real as the mountains and the seas above it, described with the same interest and the same precision that the Greeks applied to the geography of the living earth. The volcanic lake of Avernus still sits in its ring of Campanian hills, its water dark and nearly still, its surface reflecting a sky it will never quite become. The cave that ancient writers associated with the entrance to the underworld is no longer clearly identifiable, the landscape having changed over the centuries in the way that all landscapes change. The specific topography of Virgil's account and the actual ground around the lake having drifted apart by the small accumulated distances of 2,000 years. But the lake is there, the water is there, the hills circle it with the same quiet enclosure they always had, and beneath the ground of every landscape through which the rivers of the underworld were understood to run, beneath the Campanian hills, beneath the plain of Attica, beneath every piece of Mediterranean ground where the Greeks of the ancient world built their cities and planted their dead, the tradition held that the other geography continued, as it always had, rivers moving through their courses in the dark below, the asphodel meadows wide and still, the silver-pillared hall of the Styx standing at the farthest edge of the cosmos, and the pale flowers of the asphodel growing on the enormous quiet plain, exactly as they grow today, on the hillsides above it, in the full light of a world the dead no longer share. A single silver obol, held between two fingers in the light, is a smaller thing than most people expect. It is not quite the size of a thumbnail. Struck by hand rather than machine, it is slightly irregular at the edges, the metal not perfectly flat, but gently uneven in the way that hand-worked silver always is. Its surface carries a design, an owl perhaps, or a profile head in low relief, worn smoother on one side than the other from the weeks or months it spent in ordinary circulation before someone set it aside. It weighs almost nothing, and yet at some point in the 5th or 4th or 3rd century before the Common Era, in a house somewhere in the Greek world, Athens perhaps, or Corinth, or one of the island communities scattered across the Aegean, someone took a coin exactly like this one and placed it very gently on the closed eye of a person they had loved. That is where this part of the story begins. Not with the river, not with the boat, not with the ferryman standing in the gray half-light of the world's far margin, but here in a room where someone has just died, where the body has been washed and prepared and laid out, and where a living person is performing the smallest imaginable act of provision. The coin rests on the eyelid. It is cool against the skin. It does not move, and the act of placing it there is, if the tradition is taken on its own terms, one of the more consequential things a person could do for the dead. The obol was one of the smallest denominations circulating in the ancient Greek monetary system. 1/6 of a drachma was its official value, a sum so modest that a skilled craftsman working a full day might earn 6 or more of them in that single stretch of hours. The theologians and storytellers who embedded the coin into the mythology of the underworld appear to have chosen this denomination deliberately. The crossing was not priced at a tetradrach, not priced at a stater or a larger silver coin of the kind that wealthy families accumulated. It was priced at the smallest thing that counted as money at all. The message carried in that choice, if it can be called a message, was something like equity. Death was coming for everyone. The river would need to be crossed by everyone. And so the toll was set at an amount that even the most modest household could manage to include in the burial preparations of their dead. The coin was most commonly placed in the mouth, inside, or beneath the tongue, so that it would remain with the body through whatever came next. Some accounts and some archaeological finds suggest placement on the eyes instead, 1 coin per eyelid, holding the lids gently closed. Both positions serve the same practical purpose, to keep the coin in contact with the body through burial or cremation, ensuring that the dead arrived at the far shore with the means to pay their passage already in hand, or already, more precisely, in mouth. The specific geography of placement mattered because the coin needed to travel with the person, not simply accompany them in a separate vessel or a pocket of a garment that might shift or fall away. It was tucked against the body because the body was going across the water and the toll would be collected there. The ancient Greek understanding of what Charon required was that the coin be present and that it be offered. His role in the mythology was not that of a judge. He was not assessing virtue or reviewing the catalog of a life's actions. He was a ferryman at a crossing, and the crossing had a fare, and the fare was an obol, and if the obol was there, he would take it and push off from the bank with his long pole and carry the soul across to the other side. The transaction was as plain as that. It was also, for all its plainness, entirely dependent on the living. The dead could not place the coin themselves. Someone had to do it for them. The ritual was therefore not only a provision for the dead, but an act of relationship, a final thing the living could do, one last service performed at the boundary between presence and absence. That the practice was real and not merely a literary convention elaborated by poets is confirmed in the ground. The Kerameikos Cemetery in Athens, excavated across the 20th century, layer by careful layer, by archaeologists working through thousands of years of accumulated burial, yielded exactly what the text described. Coins found resting in the soil at jaw level, small discs, silver or bronze, positioned at the place where a mouth had been. The bones around them long since settled, and in some cases scattered by centuries of earth movement, but the coins themselves remaining, more durable than everything else, still in approximately the position where a living hand had set them. The Kerameikos is not a single burial site, but a vast and layered record of how the Athenians treated their dead across many generations. And among the consistencies traceable through that record is this: the coin, the position, the intent. The Macedonian royal necropolis at Vergina told a similar story at a different scale. The burials excavated there in the 1970s, and after royal tombs of extraordinary richness, containing gold crowns and ivory furniture, and weapons of fine workmanship, also contained coins in contexts suggesting the same funerary function. The wealthy and the ordinary shared the custom. The specific coin might differ, a more valuable denomination in a royal tomb, a simpler obol in a modest urban burial, but the placement and purpose were recognizable as the same practice. This was not something the poor did because they could not afford elaborate tomb goods. This was something everyone did, in one form or another, because the crossing needed to be paid for, and the living were responsible for ensuring the dead could pay. What the obol represented, then, was not wealth transferred to the afterlife. It represented access. The coin did not make the journey comfortable or distinguished. It did not guarantee any particular status on the far shore. It simply got the soul onto the boat. And that, in the structure of the Greek underworld tradition, was the irreducible necessity, the single thing that had to happen before anything else could. Without the crossing, nothing else followed. The soul could not reach the asphodel meadows, could not present itself for whatever came next, could not settle into the particular existence the tradition described for the dead. The coin was the key, not to a treasure, but to a passage, and passage was what the dead required. The small silver disc carried, in this way, an enormous weight of meaning, despite its physical modesty. When a family gathered after a death and performed the rituals of washing and preparation and laying out the body, the placement of the coin was one of the steps in a sequence that had a settled order and a settled purpose. The body had to be clean, it had to be dressed appropriately, it had to be positioned with care, and somewhere in that sequence, the coin had to be placed. The family knew what they were doing when they did it. They were completing their obligation to someone who could no longer act on their own behalf. They were, in the terms the tradition had given them, making sure the dead could get home. The long pole Charon used to push his boat across the water was called a stastris contost, asterisk in Virgil's Latin account. On the white ground lekathoi, the pale, carefully painted ceramic vessels produced in Athens during the 5th century BCE, specifically as grave goods. Charon is shown standing in a flat-bottomed boat, holding his pole upright, waiting at the river's edge, while Hermes leads the soul down to the bank. These vessels were made for the dead. They were painted with scenes of departure and crossing. They were placed in graves alongside the body, so that the image of the crossing accompanied the person into the ground, a visual companion for the journey. The coin was meant to facilitate. The painters who made them seem to have understood that the moment of waiting at the bank, Charon with his pole, Hermes at the shoulder of the newly dead, the boat resting on the water, was the moment that mattered most, the moment when the provisions had to be in place. The tradition held that Charon was not, under ordinary circumstances, moved by anything other than the presence of the coin. He was not cruel. He was not capricious. He did not charge more on some days than others, or show favoritism toward the attractive or the distinguished. He was a ferryman, doing a job that had been assigned to him, presumably, at the beginning of whatever arrangement governed the underworld, and he did it with the consistent indifference of a professional who has been doing the same work for longer than anyone can measure. The coin appeared. He ferried. The coin did not appear. He did not ferry. The logic was plain, the execution was reliable, and the burden of ensuring the transaction could happen fell entirely on the living who remained behind. Ancient sources preserved an account of what happened when the coin was absent, when a person died without proper burial, or was buried without the obol, or was lost at sea, and so never buried at all. Virgil's account, in the 6th book of the Aeneid is the one that has survived with the most detail. When Aeneas reaches the near shore of the river, in the company of the Cumaean Sibyl, and looks out at the water, he sees a crowd of souls already gathered there. They are pressing forward, reaching toward the far bank, their hands extended toward the water they cannot cross. The ferryman moves among them, but does not take them all. Those he accepts are the ones with coins, with burial, with the proper rites performed in their honor by the living. Those he leaves behind are the ones who lack these things, and they must wait. The weight in this tradition was not permanent. Virgil's Sibyl gives Aeneas the specific number, 100 years. Those who have died without burial or without the obol must wait on the near shore for 100 years before Charon will carry them across without payment. A century of waiting at the water's edge, watching the river, watching others make the crossing they cannot yet make. After that 100 years, they may cross. The obligation does not vanish, but the debt is eventually resolved by time rather than by the coin. It was a structure that placed a genuine and quantified weight on the responsibility of the living. The failure to bury the dead properly or to provide the coin was not a minor oversight. It was a harm that would persist for a very long time. That waiting at the bank is described by Virgil as a physical scene, souls pressing forward, hands stretched out, voices raised in a sound that is not quite noise, but not quite silence either. They are not suffering in any dramatic sense. They are simply waiting, which is its own particular condition, the condition of having nowhere to go and nothing to do, while the thing that cannot yet happen slowly becomes possible. 100 years is an enormous amount of time to inhabit that particular state, and the only way to prevent it was the coin, the small, modest, hand-worn, slightly irregular disc of silver or bronze placed in the mouth or on the eyes by someone who loved you and understood what the tradition asked. The specificity of the 100-year wait is worth sitting with for a moment because it says something about how the ancient Greek world understood the relationship between the dead and the living as an ongoing obligation that did not end with the funeral. The dead had needs that the living were responsible for meeting, not once at the moment of death, but in a sustained way, through proper burial, through the provision of the coin, through continued memorial observances that acknowledged the dead person's continued existence in another form. The obol was the most immediate of these obligations. It had to be performed at the moment of burial, but it was part of a broader structure of care that the tradition imposed on the living as a genuine moral responsibility. The archaeological evidence for this care is considerable, and it spans a long stretch of time. From the 5th century BCE through the Roman imperial period, roughly 6 or 7 centuries of continuous practice, coins have been recovered from burials across the Greek world and beyond. The consistency of the practice across that time span is itself remarkable. Fashions in tomb goods changed. Funerary architecture changed. The specific rituals of preparation and mourning shifted across different periods and different communities, but the coin persisted through changes in the denominations used, through the transition from predominantly silver to predominantly bronze coins in many communities, through the incorporation of the custom into Roman burial practice. As Greek influence spread westward, the basic logic, coin with the dead, coin to pay the ferryman, remained recognizable across hundreds of years and hundreds of miles of Mediterranean geography. The variation in how the custom was practiced is also part of the picture. Some burials contained a single obol. Others contained multiple coins placed in different positions on the body, under the tongue, and also on the eyes, or in the hand, as well as the mouth. Some contained small piles of coins, several denominations together, as though the family wanted to ensure the dead person arrived at the crossing with more than the minimum required. Whether this reflected anxiety, generosity, or simply a slightly different regional understanding of what was needed is not entirely clear. The texts do not explain the variation. They describe the practice in its simplest form, one coin, the passages paid, but the archaeological record suggests that in practice, families interpreted and adapted the ritual in ways that made sense to them. There is something in that variation that feels human in a particular way. The mythological structure was clear and fixed, one obol, one crossing, but the people performing the ritual were grieving, and grief does not always follow the minimum specification. Placing multiple coins on a beloved body was perhaps not a theological statement, but an emotional one, a wish that the dead person would not be short of what they needed, that whatever came next would be adequately provisioned, that the obligation had been met and then exceeded. The coin was a small act of care, and people who were not ready to stop caring found ways to make it larger. The obol was, in the most practical terms, a coin so small it had almost no monetary value in the world of the living. A single obol could not purchase a meal. It could not pay for a seat at a theater or a night's lodging. It was the kind of coin that accumulated at the bottom of a purse and was never spent on anything significant because it was not worth the effort of counting out. And yet, in the economy of the underworld, it was exactly sufficient. It paid the full fare, nothing additional was required. The ferryman took what was offered, and the soul was aboard the boat, and the crossing began. The myth that assigned this value to the smallest coin did something quietly pointed in doing so. The underworld's economy was deliberately structured differently from the world above. In the living world, the amount of money you had determined what you could access, where you could go, what treatment you received. In the underworld, the crossing was available to everyone for the same small price, and the price was small enough that even the poorest family could meet it without hardship. The theology of the obol was, at some level, a statement about equality in death. Not that the rich and poor arrived at identical destinations, or experienced identical afterlives. The tradition had plenty to say about how different kinds of souls were treated differently on the far shore. But the crossing itself, the fundamental act of passage from the world of the living to whatever came next, was not a privilege for the wealthy. It was available to everyone who had been properly buried by someone who cared enough to follow the custom. That equality was built into the coin's denomination from the beginning. Someone chose to make the toll an obol rather than a drachma. That choice was not random. It reflected a theological position that death was not the final extension of economic inequality, that the ferryman's boat was not available only to those who could afford a grander passage. The smallest coin was enough. It was exactly enough. And the living person who placed it in the mouth of the dead was performing, whether they thought about it in these terms or not, an act that honored that egalitarian principle. They were ensuring that someone they loved would not be left behind on the near shore, while wealthier souls made the crossing first. The image of the near shore, and of the souls who must wait there, is one of the more persistent in the tradition. Virgil places it at the beginning of Aeneas's journey through the underworld, as the first thing the living man and the Sibyl see when they reach the water. The crowd of waiting dead is not a frightening scene in the way that word might imply. It is simply a fact of the underworld's geography, a feature of how things work on the far margin of the world. Some souls are crossing, carried in the ferryman's boat. Others are standing at the water's edge, waiting their 100 years. The river moves between them, dark and slow, and Charon moves across it in his boat, back and forth, indifferent to those he cannot yet take, attending only to those whose coin is in hand. For Aeneas, seeing this crowd is a moment of recognition and of question. He asks the Sibyl what he is seeing, who these souls are, why they cannot cross, what they need. Her explanation is patient and precise. They are the unburied dead. They have not been given their proper rights. No coin was placed in their mouths until 100 years have passed. They must wait, and then, and this is the detail the tradition quietly insists on, after that 100 years they will cross. The wait is long, but it ends. The ferryman who would not take them without payment will eventually take them anyway after enough time has served as its own form of passage fare. There is a kind of mercy in that structure that is easy to miss on a first reading. Charon is not turning the unburied dead away forever. He is making them wait, and the waiting is not arbitrary. It is calibrated, specifically, to 100 years, after which the dead of unburied status is considered discharged by time. The tradition did not consign the improperly buried to eternal limbo. It imposed a long, quiet penalty, and then allowed the crossing. The ferryman, who seemed inflexible, was in this sense operating within a system that ultimately accommodated everyone. It simply required more time from those whose living people had not done their part. The living people who had not done their part, whether through poverty, disaster, the chaos of war, or the simple misfortune of dying at sea with no one to perform the rites, were not necessarily blamed in the tradition. Circumstances prevented proper burial for many people who would have been honored with it if circumstances had permitted. The soldier who fell on a foreign battlefield, the sailor whose ship went down without survivors, the traveler who died far from home and was never found, these were deaths that left the dead without the rites, through no fault of anyone who loved them. The tradition acknowledged this by providing the 100-year path to eventual crossing. The rule was maintained. The consequence was real. But it was not permanent, and it was not presented as a punishment for the careless bereaved, so much as a built-in accommodation for the inevitable instances in which the ideal procedure could not be followed. The Kerameikos Cemetery in Athens, where some of the clearest archaeological evidence for the obol custom was recovered, is a place worth imagining in some detail. It lies just outside the ancient walls of the city, at the edge of where the urban landscape gave way to something else. Excavations there over decades revealed not just individual burials, but the entire layered texture of how the Athenians buried their dead across many generations. Family plots arranged along funerary roads, grave markers of varying elaborateness, offering pits where mourners directed gifts downward into the earth rather than upward to the sky. And at jaw level, in burial after burial, the coins. The practice was not confined to the wealthy graves, not limited to the elaborate stone-marked tombs of prominent families. It appeared across the economic spectrum of the cemetery, in the modest burials as well as the prominent ones, consistent in its essential form, even when everything else about the burial differed. What the coin at jaw level looks like today, when the excavators find it, is a small disc in dark soil at the level where a mouth once was. The flesh dissolved long ago, the wood of any coffin dissolved, the fabric of the burial garments dissolved. But the coin remains, a piece of metal more durable than any of the organic materials that once surrounded it, holding its position in the earth with a persistence that outlasted everything else by centuries. When the archaeologist finds it there and photographs it in place and records its position and lifts it carefully for analysis, they are handling something that a grieving person placed in the mouth of someone they loved 2,000 or more years ago. The coin was not placed to be found by archaeologists. It was placed to travel with the dead. It simply happened to be too durable to disappear. That durability, the coin surviving in the earth long after the person who carried it has fully returned to the soil, is one of the more quietly striking features of the archaeological record. The dead themselves are largely gone, reduced to whatever bones remained after the passage of so many centuries. The coin persists. The small act of provision outlasts almost everything it was placed among, and there is something in that inversion, the thing that was meant to be spent, to be handed over as payment, to serve its purpose and be done with, that quietly refuses to disappear, that remains in the ground still in the position of readiness, still at the level of the mouth, still oriented as a gift given by the living to the dead. The ritual of placing the coin was not only a practical transaction or a theological formality, it was, by any reasonable reading of the tradition, an act of love. The family that washed the body and dressed it and laid it out and placed the coin were doing the last thing they could do for someone who was no longer there to receive anything. The coin could not be accepted by the person they were placing it for. It could not be acknowledged. There was no response, no expression of gratitude, no confirmation that the gesture had been received. The family placed it anyway because the tradition told them that it mattered, and because it was the last form of care available to them. The very smallness of the coin, the fact that it was worth almost nothing in the economy of the living world, made it in a sense the purest form of the gesture. It cost very little. It was given anyway, freely, as a final act of the relationship. The Greek word kaideia referred to the care of the dead, the whole complex of funerary obligations that the living owed to their dead. It encompassed washing and dressing and laying out the body, the formal lamentation, the funeral procession, the burial or cremation, and the period of mourning that followed. The obol was one element within this larger structure of obligation, not separate from it, but embedded in it, part of the specific sequence of acts that constituted proper care. To neglect kaideia was a serious failure, not simply an expression of grief, improperly managed, but a genuine wrong done to the dead person, a harm that would persist in the form of the 100-year wait on the near shore. The tradition made the living responsible for the dead's condition in a very direct way. In this sense, the myth of Charon and the obol was not primarily a story about what happened on the other side of the river. It was a story about what happened in the room where the body lay, in the hours after death and before the funeral. It was a story addressed to the living, about what the living owed and why. The terrifying ferryman at the river's edge, ancient, vigorous, pitiless in his routine, was present in the myth not to alarm the dying, but to motivate the bereaved. The image of the waiting dead, hands extended toward the far bank, pressing forward and unable to cross, was an image designed to be seen by people who were still alive and still capable of preventing that condition for the people they loved. Place the coin, perform the rites, meet the obligation. The tradition was asking something of the living, and it used the figure of the ferryman and the long wait of the unburied dead to make that asking feel necessary. A living hand holding a very small coin over the face of a person who has just died. The coin descends slowly and rests against a closed eye, or it is placed inside the mouth, beneath the tongue, where it will remain through everything that comes next. It is an amphel, worth almost nothing, worth exactly enough. Across hundreds of years and dozens of cities, and an enormous variety of other burial customs, this one thing remained consistent. The coin went with the dead. The living made sure of it. The 100-year wait on the near shore was not, in the end, a punishment that the tradition dwelt upon with any satisfaction. It was simply the consequence of an obligation left unfulfilled, a gap between what the dead needed and what the living had been able to provide. The image of the souls at the riverbank, hands reaching toward the water, is a quiet image of longing rather than suffering. They are not in pain. They are waiting, and waiting in the long arithmetic of what the tradition described was something that eventually ended. The coin was a small act of care that crossed an enormous distance, and the 100 years that elapsed without it were simply the cost of that distance, left uncovered, a long stretch of time at the water's edge, the river moving, the boat going back and forth, and on the far bank, just visible through the gray light of the underworld's geography, the place the soul was making its slow way toward. The Latin word asterisk, viaticum, asterisk meant most simply provision for a road. It was the thing a traveler carried, food, coin, whatever the journey ahead required, and the Romans used it for the living and the dead alike. When a body was prepared for burial, what was placed beside it was understood as asterisk viaticum, asterisk, the necessary provisions for the road that no living person had yet described in full, but which the tradition insisted was real and long and required preparation. The word carried the weight of practical care. It did not reach for ceremony or consolation. It named a thing needed and a thing given, the way a mother packing a bag names what goes inside it, not by its sentiment, but by its use. And then, across the wide movement of centuries, as Roman religious forms gave way and the world it shaped was reshaped again, the word itself persisted. The early Christian church adopted asterisk viaticum, asterisk for the final communion given to the dying, the Eucharist offered at the threshold of death as provision for what came after, and in that adoption, the old structure was preserved almost exactly, a journey ahead, a provision made, a careful act performed by the living on behalf of someone who was about to need it. A single word carried that structure across more than 1,000 years of changed belief and changed practice, arriving in medieval church Latin, still holding its original sense, still meaning what it had always meant, which was simply this: you will need something for the road, and we have prepared it. That continuity, a word surviving its original context, carrying its logic into a new one, is one of the quieter ways that human practices about death reveal themselves. They do not always announce their connections. They do not necessarily know they are carrying something older. The Roman mourner who placed coins and bread beside a body, and the early Christian priest who placed the Eucharist on the tongue of someone dying, were not thinking of each other, but the structure underneath, provision, journey, care, held steady across the distance between them, the way a stone holds the shape of a stream long after the particular water that shaped it has moved on. From that single thread, the practice of provisioning the dead reaches in every direction, across centuries and continents, taking forms so different in their specific materials and cosmologies that they seem at first to have nothing to do with one another, and then resolving, on longer looking, into the same gesture made again and again by people who had mostly never heard of each other. The Romans themselves arrived at the practice through Greek influence, and burial coins have been recovered from Roman sites across what was once the breadth of the empire, from burial grounds in the Italian peninsula to excavated cemeteries in Roman Britain, from sites in North Africa to provincial graves in the eastern provinces where Greek and Roman traditions overlapped and blended in ways that are still being traced by archaeologists. The Roman adaptation of the Greek burial coin was not identical to its source. The denomination varied, the precise positioning within the grave shifted across period and region, and the theological reasoning attached to the practice moved through different framings as Roman religious sensibility developed and changed. What remained consistent was the act, a coin placed with the body, a provision made, an acknowledgement that the dead person was going somewhere, and that the living could still do something useful on their behalf. In the soil of Roman Britain, in graves far from Rome and far from Greece, that acknowledgement has been found waiting in the ground, small discs of metal beside the remains of the dead, the gesture intact, the distance traveled enormous. To move from the Roman world westward and outward is to arrive at traditions with entirely different structures, different cosmologies, different relationships between the dead and the living. The ancient Egyptians developed, across thousands of years of continuous practice, one of the most elaborate and precisely detailed systems of provision for the dead in the ancient world. The texts that guided that system compiled across centuries into what is more accurately translated as Asterix, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, Asterix than by the name commonly used, were not stories in the sense that myths are stories. They were instructions, spells and maps and precise directions for a specific geography, describing the underworld they called the Duat as a landscape with distinct regions and particular dangers and a set of trials that the dead person would face in sequence on the way toward judgment. What made these texts functional in the understanding of those who commissioned and prepared them was their precision. A vague instruction was not enough. The dead person needed to know the names of the gatekeepers they would encounter, the specific words that would open each gate, the correct way to present themselves when they arrived at the hall where the heart was weighed. The provision was partly material, food, clothing, tools, furniture, everything needed for continued existence, and partly textual, the words themselves understood as a form of provision as real as bread. The weighing of the heart was the central event in the Egyptian understanding of what awaited the dead. The heart of the deceased was placed on one side of a scale, and on the other side was placed the feather of Ma'at, the principle of truth and rightness that governed not just the moral life, but the structure of the cosmos itself. Anabius, the jackal-headed god associated with embalming, and the dead oversaw the weighing. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing and knowledge, recorded the result. If the heart was lighter than the feather, if the dead person had lived in accordance with Ma'at, had not lied or stolen, or acted cruelly, had maintained the proper relationships and obligations that held the world in order, they passed onward toward the field of reeds, the paradise landscape of Egyptian cosmological geography. If the heart was heavier, the creature called Ammit, composed of crocodile and lion and hippopotamus, waited beside the scale to devour it, and the dead person ceased to exist entirely. The tomb goods placed alongside the body were provisions for the field of reeds, calibrated to what the deceased would need there: grain for planting, tools for farming, furniture for the house they would inhabit, musical instruments for the feasts they would attend, small figurines called asterisk shaptis, asterisk who would perform labor on their behalf when the gods called for workers. The field of reeds was described as a fertile landscape of water and grain and light, a place where the dead continued to live in something very close to the way they had lived before, and so what was placed in the tomb matched the destination with deliberate practical precision. The scale of Egyptian funerary provision varied enormously with wealth and status, reaching its most elaborate expression in the tombs of the pharaohs, whose preparations involved entire complexes of buildings and the labor of many people over many years. But the underlying logic provision made for a specific destination, the living equipping the dead for what came next, was present at every level of Egyptian society, translated into whatever materials a particular family could afford. A wealthy official might have hundreds of asterix shaptis, asterisks and painted walls depicting the entire sequence of the afterlife journey. A laborer might have a few modest goods and a single asterix shapti asterix, or a painted wooden panel showing the weighing of the heart. What connected them was not the quantity, but the intention, to prepare the dead person for a real place, with real requirements, and to send them there with what they would need. Across the Mediterranean basin, and northward through the European continent into the cold of Scandinavia, the same structural impulse appears in entirely different clothing. The Norse traditions that survive in the sagas and the asterisk Eddas asterisk and the accounts of outside observers describe a cosmos with multiple realms, 9 in the reckoning that the sources provide, each with its own character and inhabitants. The dead went to different places depending on how they had died, and what was understood about those places shaped what the living placed in graves. Those who died in battle and were chosen by the Valkyries went to Valhall, the great hall of Odin, where they feasted and fought in preparation for the final conflict at the end of the world. Those who died of illness or old age went to Hel, the realm presided over by the goddess of the same name, whose domain the sources describe as cold and dim, but not necessarily punitive, simply the common destination of the common dead. The provisions placed in Norse graves reflected an understanding of continued existence that was in its essential structure not so different from the Egyptian field of reeds. The dead would go on living, and so they needed the equipment of living. The Oseberg ship burial, excavated in Norway in 1904 from a burial mound where it had rested since approximately 834 CE, is the most complete surviving example of what a high-status Norse burial provision could be. The ship itself, large enough to have sailed, its hull preserved by the particular clay of the burial mound, had been packed with the contents of a household assembled for a long departure. Sleds were placed inside it, constructed with the same care as the sleds used by the living. Gnawed carved cart was included, its decoration detailed enough to suggest it was an object of significance rather than simply a conveyance. Beds and bedposts were present, along with textiles, some of the best preserved early medieval textiles in the world, including fragments of tapestry depicting figures and animals. Kitchen equipment was laid in alongside the larger furnishings: tools, buckets, a cauldron. The bodies of horses and cattle were placed with the burial, animals slaughtered to accompany the dead. At the center of it all were two women, their remains resting in the ship's stern cabin, surrounded by everything the tradition understood they would need. Who the women were is not certain. The debate about their identities continues, but what the burial tells us about how their world understood death is specific. The dead go on, and they go on as themselves, and what they carried in life they should carry into whatever came after. The ship as burial vessel was not solely practical, although it was also that. Norse cosmological geography described the worlds as connected by waterways and routes and pathways of various kinds, and the ship was understood as a vehicle capable of crossing those distances. To bury a person in a ship, or to burn a ship burial on the shore, was to provide both the provisions and the means of travel simultaneously. The boat itself, as asterisk viaticum asterisk, the most comprehensive provision imaginable for someone setting out on the longest possible journey. That logic is visible in ship burials of various scales across Scandinavia and into parts of the British Isles, where Norse cultural presence was strong, each reflecting the same fundamental understanding that the dead departed, and departure required preparation. And preparation was an act of care that the living owed the dead as a serious obligation. From the Norse world eastward, moving in a different direction entirely, the same obligation appears in Chinese tradition in a form that transforms the logic of provision into something that can only be described as genuinely ingenious. The tradition of burning jichan, joss paper, or spirit money, as it is variously translated, rests on a specific understanding of how material things move between the living world and the world of the dead. Ordinary objects do not cross that boundary as themselves. The mechanism of transfer is fire. When paper is burned, what it represents passes through the fire and arrives on the other side in the spirit world as the thing it was meant to be. A sheet of paper printed with a denomination burned at a grave or at a ceremonial fire becomes real currency in the spirit world. A paper model of a house, folded and fitted with paper furniture and paper appliances, burns and becomes a real house. The paper is a carrier, and the fire is the translation, and what arrives is understood as real and functional, as genuinely useful to the dead person as any object physically placed in a grave. The documented origins of this practice in China are traced to the Tang dynasty, which lasted from 618 to 907 CE, making it a practice with more than 13 centuries of recorded history. But the tradition did not freeze in the Tang period, but continued to develop, adapting its specific forms to whatever the living world considered valuable and necessary at any given time. The paper goods burned in contemporary ceremonies include, alongside the traditional spirit money and incense, paper representations of things the modern world considers important. Houses designed in contemporary architectural styles, fitted with paper television sets and paper air conditioning units, paper automobiles of recognizable current models, paper smartphones, paper computers, paper credit cards. The logic is the same as it has always been. Provision the dead with what they need for a continued existence, and the provision updates itself to match what the living understand as necessary and comfortable. This is not a simplification of the tradition or a sign of its decline. It is the tradition working exactly as it was always designed to work, which is to say, with practical attention to the actual requirements of the person being provided for. The burning of joss paper remains a living practice in Chinese communities around the world, at graveside ceremonies, at the Qingming festival, when families visit and tend the graves of their ancestors, at the Hungry Ghost Festival, when offerings are made more broadly to spirits who may not have living family to care for them. The smoke rises and the paper transforms, and the gesture of provision is made as seriously and as carefully as it has been made for over 1,000 years. At a Qingming ceremony, the fire is practical. There is real paper, real flame, real ash rising in the air, and the attention given to it is not nostalgic or ceremonial in a hollow sense. The paper is chosen with care. The denominations matter. The paper house is folded properly. The care is the same care that an Egyptian family brought to choosing which asterisk shapties, asterisks to commission, or a Norse household brought to packing a ship. The same seriousness about a real task, translated into entirely different materials and a different cosmological framework, but recognizable at its structural core as the same act. The Royal Cemetery of excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s in what is now southern Iraq, opened a window onto funerary practice from approximately 2600 to 2400 BCE, burial assemblages from the very early Bronze Age, more than 4,000 years old. What Woolley found in the most significant of these graves was provision on a scale that required considerable rethinking of what had been assumed about the sophistication of early Mesopotamian society. Gold helmets, crafted with a precision that still draws attention, lyres, some decorated with golden bulls' heads, whose surfaces had survived 4,500 years in the ground, game boards inlaid with shell and lapis lazuli, garments of which only the decorative elements remained, their fabric long dissolved, but the arrangement of beads and gold pieces still mapping the shape of what had been worn, and beside and around the primary burials, the remains of many attendants, grooms with their animals, musicians with their instruments, soldiers with their weapons, who had apparently been given something to drink and had lain down and died in their positions, accompanying the dead person into the ground. The Mesopotamian understanding of what awaited the dead was not one of comfort. The underworld described in Mesopotamian literature, the realm called Urkala, or the land of no return, was dark and still, a place where the dead ate dust and clay, where existence was diminished to something barely recognizable as life. The asterisk epic of Gilgamesh, asterisk, which carries some of the most ancient surviving literary material, touches on the underworld in terms that make clear the Mesopotamian view of it was not consolatory. The dead went somewhere, and where they went was not good, and the only mitigation came from what the living could send with them, and what the living continued to provide afterward through regular offerings. The size and completeness of the burial assemblages reflected the understanding that a person of status required an entire court, servants, musicians, guards, to maintain anything resembling their former life in the diminished world below. The provisions were not optimistic, they were necessary, and the necessity was taken seriously enough to result in burials of extraordinary material richness, and by the evidence of what Woolley found, enormous personal cost. The lyre recovered from the royal cemetery of its wooden body long gone, but its golden bull's head decoration preserved, its form reconstructed by scholars and now held in museum collections, is an object made to produce sound, interred in the ground to accompany its owner into silence. That specific detail, a musical instrument given to the dead, appears in multiple traditions across multiple centuries and geographies. Musical instruments are found in Egyptian tombs. They are described in Norse burial accounts. The logic each tradition applied was different, the cosmological destination different, the specific understanding of what music would mean or do for the dead person different. But the gesture was repeated, independently, in traditions that had no direct contact with one another, which suggests something about how human beings have consistently understood the relationship between beauty and necessity, that the beautiful things are not luxuries in excess of what the dead require, but part of what the dead are understood to need, as essential as food or coin or fire. The breadth of this pattern, its appearance across Egypt and Mesopotamia, and the Norse world, and China, and Rome, and Greece, and the many traditions not named here, does not mean that all these practices are saying the same thing. They are not. The Egyptian field of reeds, and the Norse Valhalla, and the Chinese spirit world, and the Mesopotamian land of no return are not the same place with different names. They are genuinely different cosmological propositions, reflecting different understandings of what the dead need, what kind of existence awaits them, what obligations the living carry, and what the relationship between the two worlds requires. The differences matter as much as the similarities. To flatten them into a single statement about what all traditions believe would be to miss what is most interesting about each of them, which is the specific shape of the particular tradition's thinking, the precise calibration of the provision to the destination, the exact logic by which the living understood themselves to be responsible. What they share is not a conclusion but a question, asked seriously and answered differently by each tradition in turn. What do the dead need, and can we still provide it? The obol in the mouth was one answer. The asterisk shabtis, asterisk lining the walls of a tomb, were another. A ship packed with sleds and cattle, and a carved cart was another. Joss paper rising as smoke and ash at a family ceremony in a city in the contemporary world is another still. Each answer carries within it a cosmology, a specific understanding of where the dead go, what that place is like, and what counts as care across that distance. None of these answers can be reduced to mere custom or sentiment without losing what made them real to the people who practiced them. They were practical, they were serious. They were performed by people who genuinely believed they were doing something useful for someone they had loved, and that belief shaped the quality of attention they brought to the task. The care taken in choosing the coin, folding the paper, packing the ship, commissioning the text. Joss paper burns at a contemporary ceremony, and the smoke rises, and the paper's surface is briefly visible before the fire takes it. The ink, the denomination, the printed surface of what it represents, and then it is ash, and it has gone somewhere, and the person who burned it has done something real. The fire does not diminish the seriousness of the gesture. The centuries behind it do not make it a relic. This particular form of care, provision made, journey acknowledged, the dead not forgotten and not simply mourned, but actively supplied with what they need, is not something that belongs to the past. It is something still being done today by people for whom it carries full weight, the full meaning it has always carried, the full seriousness of a task undertaken for someone who can no longer ask for it themselves, but for whom the asking has been answered anyway, in fire and smoke, and the careful choice of what the paper carries when it goes. The smoke rises, the ash settles. The provision has been made, and somewhere in the long record of human care for the dead, in the soil of the Cormacos and the clay of Ur, and the burial mound at Oseberg, and the decorated walls of a tomb cut into the rock above the Nile Valley, and the ash of 1,000 contemporary fires, the same gesture can be found, made in so many different hands and so many different materials that it covers the whole of recorded human time, patient and attentive and still going. Asterisk, cruda viridesque senectus. Asterisk, a green and vigorous old age. That is the phrase Virgil chose for Charon in the 6th book of the Asterisk Aeneid. Asterisk, and it is worth staying with for a moment, because it is an unusual thing to say about anyone. The Latin holds two ideas that normally have no business being in the same sentence. Asterisk cruda asterisk, which carries the sense of something raw, unripe, still charged with sap, and asterisk senectus, asterisk, the condition of being very old, pressed together into a single phrase that refuses to resolve into either one. Charon looks ancient. His beard is unkempt and white. His cloak is knotted and filthy. The skin of his face is weathered past any age a human face would recognize. And yet the body beneath all of that is not failing. It is not decaying toward anything. He stands in his boat with the same physical readiness he has always had, pushing his pole through the water with arms that show no sign of tiring, and the ancient quality of his face has nothing to do with the slow erosion of time. He is outside that erosion. Time does its work on everything it can reach, but it cannot quite reach Charon, and the result is a figure who carries the appearance of age without being subject to its processes, ancient-looking, vigorous, and entirely unchanged from whatever he was at the beginning. Virgil positions him on the water in his flat-bottomed boat, the long pole called the asterisk contus, asterisk held upright, wearing the distinction of his office in the state of his clothes and the quality of his gaze. The eyes that the ancient Greeks derived his name from, those keen, gleaming, fixed eyes, are described in the asterisk Anunid, asterisk, as blazing like fire beneath the brow of an old man, and the combination is unsettling only if one expects the figure to be either frail or young. Charon is neither. He is precisely what the tradition always said he was, a being who does not age, does not tire, does not change, because his function does not change. and the unchanging nature of his work has made him unchanging in himself. Souls arrive at his bank. He ferries them across. He has been doing exactly this since before the Olympian gods were born, and he will be doing it when the world the myths describe has passed into something the myths have not bothered to narrate, because that event is simply too far ahead to matter to anyone at the water's edge. This is the portrait that became the template. After the sixth book of the Aeneid, was written. Sometime in the decades before the 1st century BCE, artists and poets who wanted to depict the ferryman came back to Virgil's specific vocabulary: the white beard, the filthy cloak, and the blazing eyes, the pole, the flat boat moving across dark water. The details propagated through Western art the way good descriptions do, because they were precise enough to be reproducible and strange enough to stay interesting across repetition. A painter in 16th century Flanders working on a commissioned altarpiece would still be working, in some sense, from those same Latin phrases, transformed by the intervening centuries, but not lost. The figure in the Aeneid who watches Charon from the bank and needs to understand him is Aeneas, guided by the Cumaean Sibyl through the underworld's vestibule. Aeneas sees the ferryman in the middle distance, already at work, already moving the boat, already receiving the crowd of dead souls pressing toward the water, and what strikes him, or what Virgil reports as striking him, is the sheer number of them, souls without number filling the bank, the way dry leaves fall in autumn, the way birds gather over the sea when the cold drives them south. The Sibyl provides context. Those who are being carried across are the buried, those who have had their coin and their proper rights. Those still pressing at the bank, hands extended toward the far shore, unable to board, are the unburied, the ones for whom no coin was placed, no grave was dug, no ceremony was performed. They must wait, the Sibyl explains, for 100 years before Charon will carry them across without payment. They are not being punished. They are simply waiting, in the particular condition of those whose living kin were unable or unwilling to provide the small thing that would have moved them through. 100 years is a long time to wait at a river's edge. It is not described as anguish. It is described as a condition, a status, a kind of suspension, not of time exactly, but of the journey time was supposed to permit. What Virgil understood, or what the tradition he was drawing from understood, is that Charon's role has a kind of absolute simplicity at its center. He does not judge, he does not assign destinations, he does not decide who was virtuous and who was not, which soul deserves the Elysian fields, and which will find the asphodel meadows. Those determinations belong to other figures, other tribunals, other parts of the underworld's administration. Charon's work is only the crossing itself, the moment of passage from one bank to the other, the physical act of moving a soul from the shore of the living to the shore of the dead. He is neither judge nor jailer. He is a ferryman. He carries people across water. The simplicity of the job description does not diminish him. It defines him. And within that definition, he has been, for 2,500 years of Western cultural memory, steadily and completely himself. The comic playwright Aristophanes understood this about him. In the Frog's Asterisk, staged in Athens in 405 BCE, Charon appears without introduction, without explanatory frame, without the theatrical convention of establishing who he is and why the audience should know him. The Athenians sitting in the theater of Dionysus already knew. They had known the ferryman of the dead long enough that Aristophanes could put him on stage as a working man with a boat to run and a schedule to keep, and the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of a craftsman who has done this job more times than he has ever bothered to count. The god Dionysus, attempting to travel to the underworld, is told to get in the boat and row, not a special oar, not a ceremonial gesture, just the oar and the work. Charon collects his fare with the directness of someone who has heard every possible attempt at special pleading and remains completely unmoved by all of it. He is familiar in the oldest sense of the word, a figure the culture had been living with long enough to find comfortable, to make jokes about, to put on a stage without needing to explain. The fact that he could serve as the straight man in a comedy, the reliable, unhurried constant against which Dionysus's anxious antics played out, is evidence of how completely the figure had settled into the 5th century Athenian imagination. He was not exotic. He was known. He was known well enough, too, that exceptions to his rules were understood as genuine exceptions, events worth narrating precisely because they were so rare. The musician Orpheus persuaded Charon to carry him across while still alive, not through argument, not through divine authority, not through force, through music. Virgil tells this in the Georgics. Ovid tells it in the Metamorphoses and both accounts describe the same remarkable moment, the lyre playing, the voice rising, and Charon, who had not been moved by anything in all the uncountable time of his ferryman's existence, stilling his boat. The tradition does not say he was charmed in the sense of being tricked. It says he was moved. The distinction matters. Charon was not deceived by the music's beauty into confusing Orpheus for someone else, or into forgetting his own rules. He heard the music and chose for this one occasion to waive what he would ordinarily have refused. Even Cerberus stopped. Even the Furies paused. The entire machinery of the underworld's gatekeeping was suspended for the duration of a song, and when the song ended, the machinery resumed, and Orpheus crossed, and the myth turned in the direction it was always going to turn. Ancient sources treated this exception as evidence of something specific about music, its capacity to negotiate with forces that are otherwise non-negotiable. Not all music, Orpheus's music, a particular quality of the particular art of this particular figure, and even then only in one direction. The crossing was granted, the return was conditional, the condition was violated, Eurydice was lost. Charon was not ultimately persuaded that the living should be allowed to disturb the dead's country. He granted a passage. The tradition maintained the rule beneath the exception, and the exception made the rule feel more real, not less. The Flemish painter Joachim Patinier returned to this rule in approximately 1520 in the painting now held by the Museo del Prado in Madrid. He rendered it as a landscape, and that choice is itself part of the painting's meaning. The composition spreads wide, water filling much of the middle ground, two shores visible simultaneously on the left and right edges of the canvas. The left shore is lush and luminous, green hills, soft light, figures at ease in what the Christian-inflected composition presents as a paradise. The right shore is darker, streaked with what appears to be fire, its sky a murky reddish color. The figures there less distinct, less comfortable. Between them, the water, and on the water, in a flat-bottomed boat at the exact center of the composition, a very small Charon bending to his oar. He is small within the painting in a way that emphasizes the landscape rather than the figure, not because Patinier considered him unimportant, but because the painting's argument is precisely that Charon's crossing is an event within a geography much larger than himself. He is not the painting's protagonist, he is the painting's axis. Everything turns around him and through him. The soul in the boat with him is in the process of deciding, or perhaps of having its direction decided for it, which shore to move toward, and the ferryman at the center of that question is bending to his work, as he always has been, indifferent to the particular drama of this particular soul's destination, concerned only with the crossing itself. Patineer was painting within a Christian visual language. The two shores carry unmistakable resonances of heaven and hell, and yet the figure at the center is not a Christian figure. He is Charon, drawn directly from the classical tradition, carrying the visual inheritance of Virgil's description across the 15 or so centuries that separated the asterisk Aeneid asterisk from this Flemish workshop. The painting is a place where two cosmological systems share a canvas without resolving into each other, and what keeps them from collapsing is the figure at the center who belongs fully to neither. He is the hinge. He has always been the hinge, the point at which whatever the tradition says about death passes through the act of crossing from one world to another. The cosmological language changes around him. The function does not. There is a particular kind of persistence in this, in a figure that originated in the archaic Greek period, in a fragment of a poem by Stesichorus that is now mostly lost, that was already culturally central by the time Aristophanes staged it in 405 BCE, that Virgil made canonical in Latin, that Patineer translated into the visual language of Northern European Renaissance painting. This figure has been in more or less continuous cultural use for something approaching 2,500 years. Not every element of his original form survived intact across that span. Traditions do not transmit perfectly. They adapt to new containers, new languages, new theological frameworks. And so what happened in Greece over the long centuries that separate the classical period from the present is that Charon changed. The figure known in modern Greek folk tradition as asterisk, Charos, asterisk, or asterisk Charontos asterisk, no longer stands in a boat on a river. He arrives on horseback. He does not wait for the dead to come to him. He goes to claim them, traveling through the world of the living, visible in some traditions as a dark rider, in others simply as a presence that arrives when it is time. He is addressed directly in the traditional laments called Morologia, sung primarily by women at funerals and at wakes, in which Charos is spoken to as though he is present in the room, because in the context of the lament he is in the room, he has come for someone, and the women singing are speaking to him, arguing with him, telling him what the person he has come for meant to those being left behind, pleading on their behalf, bargaining, grieving aloud into the presence of the one who is taking them. The Morologia have been recorded by ethnomusicologists and scholars over the past century. They continue to be performed in villages in Crete, in the Mani Peninsula, in other parts of Greece today. They are not performances of the tradition in the sense of theatrical reconstruction. They are the tradition, still active, still performed when someone dies, still addressed to the same figure by a different form of his name. The name itself, Charon, 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 Charos, is the thread that can be traced from the archaic Greek fragment, through Virgil and Aristophanes, through Byzantine-era texts, through the folk tradition of the present day. And what the name connects is not one fixed figure, but a family of related figures, each shaped by the world in which it was understood, each performing the same essential function under the same name across a documented span of approximately 2,500 years. This is not a short time. Most things that humans make do not last 2,500 years. Stories are among the things that sometimes do, and the story of the one who ferries the dead is among the most persistent of those. Part of the persistence comes from what the figure represents, which is not exactly death. The Greeks had thanatos for death itself, and the modern Greek Charos is a figure distinct from any particular theological system, but rather something more structural. Charon represents the threshold, the crossing, the moment at which the condition of living gives way to whatever comes after it, translated into the concrete terms of a man with a boat and a pole, and a reasonable expectation that his fare will be paid. The ferry crossing is one of the oldest human technologies for thinking about transition. Ferries cross boundaries. They move between two different kinds of territory across a gap that cannot be walked. They require a human agent who lives in neither place but moves between them, someone defined by the act of crossing rather than by belonging to either shore. The Charon is precisely this kind of figure, someone whose identity is constituted entirely by the threshold he occupies, not by the world on either side of it. May be part of why the tradition found the image so durable. It did not require a specific cosmological belief to make sense of it. It required only the intuition that the boundary between living and dead is a real one, and that moving across it would need to be done somehow, by someone. The coins placed in ancient graves were the physical acknowledgement of that need. They were small. They were deliberately small. The obol set at the most modest denomination available, so that the provision could be made by any family regardless of means. The coin is still found in excavated graves from the 5th century BCE forward through the Roman period, lying in the soil at the level of where a jaw would have been, a small disk of silver or bronze, undisturbed for 2,000 years. The practice spread with Greek culture and survived into Roman usage, where the asterisk viaticum asterisk, the provision for a journey, became the standard term for what was left with the dead, and that same word carried forward into the Christian tradition as the name for the final communion given to the dying. The last provision for the last journey, the term traveling through the centuries intact, even after the specific theological freight had changed entirely. A word that began on a coin beside a corpse in a Greek grave and ended as a sacrament administered in a hospital room, carrying the same structural idea across more than a millennium of very different beliefs about what lay on the other side of dying. The care that the ancient practice represented is part of what makes Charon himself a particular kind of figure. He is not a judge. He is not a punisher. He is the reason the coin mattered, and the reason the coin mattered is that without it the crossing would be delayed, which is to say the dead would be kept waiting in an unresolved condition, neither in the world they had left, nor yet in whatever world lay beyond the water. The coin was the living's way of completing the death, of finishing the passage that dying had begun, of not leaving someone suspended at the threshold longer than necessary. And the ferryman who received the coin and made the crossing possible was, in this sense, the instrument of that care, not a terrifying figure demanding payment under threat, but the figure whose presence in the cosmology gave the act of burial its most specific purpose. You buried someone properly. You gave them the coin so that they would not wait. The theology of the obol is a theology of not letting the people you loved wait at a cold water's edge for longer than they had to. Charon, in this reading, was not the obstacle. He was the way through. This reading of the ferryman, steady, functional, outside time, defined by the crossing, carries forward into the whole question of what his long persistence in Western culture amounts to. He is in Dante's Commedia asterisk, eyes ringed with fire, driving his boat through hell's first river. He is in the imagery of countless medieval and Renaissance paintings, where the underworld and the classical tradition were invoked for the visual weight they carried. He is in the modern Greek folk songs where Charon arrives on horseback and the women in the room address him by name. He is in the coins still lying in the dark in ancient graves across the Mediterranean and beyond, the gesture of placement still intact in the earth, exactly as it was made. The figure has moved through an enormous amount of human time and cultural change, and has arrived, recognizably itself, in a world that still burns paper for the dead, that still places coins on the eyes of the dying, in some communities, that still has a word, asterisk viaticum, asterisk, whose etymology traces back to the very practice that gave Charon his fair. The detail of the coins, in the end, is where the figure comes to rest most quietly,